My name is Mthuli Ncube. I'm a professor of public policy at the Blavatnik School. And of course, I love the business school. That's why I'm here. And welcome to this session on navigating politics as we seek to do business in Africa. My colleague, he will introduce himself. He can always say more. Martin Bratt is a partner at McKinsey, and he focuses on the extractive industries, public sector. He knows a lot about what's going on in Africa, and I think you'll enjoy his talk. So the strategy is as follows. We have 45 minutes. So I'll ask in a minute Martin to come in and do a presentation, just set out the principles of how to navigate the politics, what you should care about. In fact, this applies to anywhere, wherever you go, frankly. That's not just Africa. And then I'll come back and also I'll raise some points around this issue. We have a bit of a debate, and then we leave the last 25 minutes or so for a Q&A, for a discussion with everyone else. Is that okay? Thank you. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Professor. Can you all hear me? I have been mic'd up, so I think you should be able to hear me. So I will just sit here in that case, because that is so much more comfortable than walking the stage. Thank you for your kind introduction. A couple of words about myself. So I am a partner with McKinsey based in our London office, but I do the majority of my work across the African continent. So in Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, but also a number of other places. And I tend to work at the intersection of business and government. And so this topic of how to navigate the politics and how to navigate relationships with government stakeholders and others is something that's very dear to my heart. And I want to start by asking, I had another front page that was necessary. I want to start by asking you a very different question. What do you think has had the biggest impact on the average score of basketball over the last kind of 70 years, or since they started the NBA? What is the thing that has changed the most the outcomes of the game? Does anyone have any questions or any ideas? The three-point line? Any other points? Okay, it's a little bit hard to hear, but there's a couple of things we can envisage, right? It could be changes to tactics, changes to the way teams play the game, right? Like zone defense or other things that have been innovated. It could be new talent. It could be the fact that you have better players. You have superstars, like Michael Jordan. I'm a little bit older than most of you, so that he is kind of my reference basketball player. New entrants, people who invest capital in training or in the way they work and so on. Or it could be changes to sports science or technology. The way teams train their people, the nutrition, the exercise, and so on. But actually, it's none of these. The biggest change is the 24-second clock, which was introduced in 1954 in order to basically create a more exciting game. And immediately, the average score of an NBA game jumped 17 points. So why am I talking about basketball when the topic of this speech is business in Africa? Well, I talk about basketball because it's an illustrative example of how we think about markets and how we think about business, right? Since we're in a business school, I'm going to introduce the extremely basic framework of the 5 forces, which some of you might occasionally have seen. So we tend to think about businesses as being, and markets and industries as a consequence of the power balance between suppliers and buyers, how easy it is to get new entrants, what substitute products there is, and therefore the kind of intensity of the competition. And this is a very useful framework, but what it misses is the point around the 24-second clock. It misses the referee. It misses the person that sets the rules of the game. And that is incredibly important, and it's getting more and more important. And because we're talking about Africa here, I would say it is more important in Africa than it is anywhere else. Because the rules of the game change. They change all the time, and they change in unpredictable ways. Just ask, people drilling for oil and gas, or people running mines across the African continent, right? Changes to tax rates and investment regimes is just one of the ways that impact their profitability. But also things like local content legislation, ownership requirements, the whole entire framework in which you operate can very easily change overnight, either because because there have been elections, for example, or because there have been other changes or other ways in which things work. So all of this and that has a huge importance for your business. And it's not just in the extractive sector, right? I think the beverage industry and the beer industry is an interesting example. Southern Africa, in particular Botswana, has seen very heavy increases in taxes on beer over the last 10 years, starting from a public health concern area, right? And so it's not, and that has very, very big implications for the companies operating in that space. But it's not just a risk, right? If you continue with the beer example, looking at how international beverage companies have engaged with authorities can actually be a huge upside for them as well. Because the biggest competition that they're facing in many African markets isn't from other international beer brands. It is from domestically produced local brews. And if you can work with the authorities to sort of think about public health consequences and so on of some of that, then that can also create a great competitive advantage for them. Finally, I just love this example. So I've put up a picture of the Lekki Expressway. I'm sure we have some Nigerians here who've driven the Lekki Expressway. Yeah, it's a great example, right? It's often hailed as a fantastic success for public-private partnerships because it was built. It was financed by public-private, exactly. However, I don't think any of the money was paid back because they discovered that the politics was more tricky than they thought. Very difficult, very difficult. Anyway, so what does all of this mean? And as a business, when you think about doing this, what should you do and what should you think about? And I wanted to just highlight 6 questions before we go into the conversation. 6 questions of things that I believe businesses should think about. By the way, wherever they are in the world, but I do think that these are particularly salient when doing business on the continent. The first one of this is, can you anticipate the different issues and the different external issues that will influence your business? And this is really about not really understanding this only when it's hitting you, right? We were just talking before this conversation about the platinum industry in South Africa, right? Huge issues over the last 2-3 years, strikes, riots, new unions coming in, like tremendous social consequences across South African society, tremendous business consequences for the companies operating in this space. Why did that all happen? Well, the origin of all of this was like a legacy of the apartheid system that was never properly dealt with, right? So the working conditions in the mines and in the houses where the migrant workers were living had not improved or not improved sufficiently since the end of apartheid, and that created a social and socio-economic environment that was ripe for explosion. Yes, this was something that companies would say, this isn't just our fault. But if they had understood the problem before it exploded, they could have saved themselves and they could have saved society an enormous amount of pressure. So really thinking about this ahead of time is incredibly important. The second one is to look at all of these issues and then really filter and understand what do they mean for your bottom line, right? And I'm not here to say that bottom line is the only thing that matters. But as a business, when you think about politics and when you think about different issues that are being thrown up by politics, you need to be able to prioritize. And in order to do that, you need to take a rigorous and fact-based approach to understand what these mean for your profits and for your bottom line. That is going to be the only way that you can explain to your shareholders why you are spending time and energy on addressing them. So really doing that in quite a rigorous way is tremendously important. The third part is around stakeholder management. So stakeholder management is a word that everyone's kind of throwing out there. But again, this needs to be done not just by kind of hiring people to go around and talk to communities and politicians and NGOs. It needs to be done in a rigorous, fact-based way where you look at your stakeholders issue by issue and you understand, A, how important is this issue to this stakeholder, and B, how influential is this stakeholder in changing the outcome of this topic, right? So that you can really understand both which stakeholder you need to prioritize and which who are going to be willing to listen to you, and secondly, which stakeholders you need to reach in order to address the topic that you're trying to deal with. So that's the third topic. The fourth one is really about what I call considering your stance. when businesses talk to governments and businesses talk to politicians, far too often they tend to take a reactive stance. They come at it at a point where something has happened, some legislation has come in or some regulation has changed, and they are moaning and complaining and saying, oh, this is destroying our business, it's destroying it's a very reactive, negative attitude. However, if you really want to create value, you should really think about, how can I approach this topic? Could I do this in a much more proactive way? Could I be the ones coming in and suggest regulation, for example? Could I go in and say, actually, I am going to be the company that's going to come in and be a positive influence for change here. Thereby, they can generate enormous societal value and also business value. Let me just give you one example, because I've been saying bad things about the mining industry in South Africa. I think the way some of the companies, and I think Anglo Gold Ashanti and Anglo American come to mind, the way they dealt with the HIV/AIDS issue in South Africa is a great example of of companies going in and saying, we are going to provide medication to our workers and to their families when the government isn't willing to do it, because we believe it's the right thing to do and we believe that it's going to create long-term business value, right? Being proactive and engaged in that way, I think, set them up for a societal position that has greatly helped them in many ways in their interactions with South African society and government. So the fifth one is around identifying arguments and creating alliances. Right? You will never get very far on your own, but by thinking about this as yourself, as part of an alliance, and by shaping the arguments that you use when you approach businesses and when you approach politicians, you have much greater chances of outcomes. And in order to do that, you need to understand what the others, that's rooted in the kind of understanding of the stakeholders, and you need to really understand what other people are looking for and what they want to get out of things. And finally, are you resourcing this issue appropriately? Far too often, I see large companies, this is true around the world, it is particularly true in Africa, you see large companies who approach this topic as if it could be resolved by one or two people in their government relations department, right? Let's find a former minister or a former senior civil servant, and let's pay them a nice salary and set them up in an office, and they will sort of fly around and sort out all of our stakeholder relationship issues. That is not how you do it. This topic needs proper resourcing. It needs analytical resource. It needs the smartest people in the organization to spend a significant amount of their time thinking about it. And that is the only way I think you can both create and protect value as a business. Just in conclusion, and before handing over to Professor Ncube, if we look at, I like to use the analogy of marketing. 40 years ago or 50 years ago, many of you will watch the show Mad Men, and you will know that the discipline of marketing and advertising was very much a couple of guys, because they were guys at the time, in their chair, in their sort of comfortable chairs with a whiskey, kind of thinking about, oh, creative idea here, creative idea there. 40 years later, marketing and advertising has become the most data-driven and scientific of all business disciplines, right? Where they have numbers, and they understand their markets, they understand their customers, they understand the spend effectiveness. It is a hyper-scientific, numbers-driven business. I think that the business of government relations and the business of stakeholder management needs to make the same leap. It needs to move from a kind of largely intuition-based, kind of superficial, let's just get a couple of smart people in the room type of thinking, to a much more data-driven, analytical, disciplined exercise. And I think that is particular. The African stakeholder landscape and the African political landscape is incredibly complex, and I think this is what we will come to that in our conversation. And if you think that you can navigate that landscape simply by hiring a former minister, to be your head of external relations, I really think that you're making a big mistake. So that was sort of my introduction, Professor. Would you have any thoughts?
Absolutely. I want to pick up on a point that you raised, for the last 2 points you raised about the framework. That I think one thing we should add is something about risk management. It really pays if you've got a tried, perhaps tested and testable business continuity strategy. Because when there is political risk in a country, often things move so fast you can't even get out. Now, and I'll give you a few examples. One, I recall with the African Development Bank, where I used to work as vice president and chief economist before I came to Oxford, caught up in the political quagmire in Côte d'Ivoire 12 years ago. It had to leave in a hurry and ended up in Tunisia, right? So after 10 years in Tunisia, it left again in a hurry back to Côte d'Ivoire, because what had happened in Tunisia had also changed quite dramatically, and I lived through that change, and Côte d'Ivoire had improved quite a bit. And one thing I realized is that actually when I was in Tunisia, we never understood what was going on. In fact, very few people understood what was going on in society. I don't think we're even capable of understanding what was going on. You know, diplomats, always interacting among ourselves, the foreign elite, blah, blah. You don't even get it. You don't understand what's going on in society. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you're a company in Africa, you must have a good business continuity strategy. That's what I told my friends at PTA Bank. I said, you are based in what, in Burundi? Did you say Burundi? You must have a strong business continuity strategy, and they have one. So they're now operating from Nairobi after the issues in Cameroon. So this is real, people. I'm telling you, it's very important that companies will recognize this. Now, number two, Martin made a point about navigating, understanding deeper the politics is complex and so forth. Businesses think it's enough to hire a chief economist like me, and then maybe a former minister, a government relations person. It's not enough. Find also a very good political scientist. I really mean good, who can really spend time investing in understanding the local trend, social dynamics. That's what you need to understand. We're in a similar conversation, by the way, 2 days ago here in Oxford, talking to the international development community, whom you think understand these countries, even they don't. They don't have political scientists here, and I made the same point. It's very important to understand the landscape. Another point is, there's a project that up to today I feel so sore. I worked so hard on it. It's a project in Mali. Maybe some of you have heard me tell this story before. The Makala Sugar Project. Some of you anyone from Mali here who knows anything about the Makala Sugar Project? Going, gone. Okay, no one. Now, wonderful PPP project with Ilovo as a private sector operator, with the African Development Bank being the kind of long-term provider of development finance. And then I worked hard to make sure that we get a good concession from the government as a partner. I insisted that Ilovo should really make sure that these local farmers are included in the supply chain and outgrowers thing. A beautiful project on paper. So we launched, and then a few months later, Mali happened. It's exploded. And the project was normal. And Ilovo had to pull out, of course. We just stood back, we couldn't do anything. Then again, I realized that we did not understand the politics. I'm making my third point here is about paying attention to what I call points of inflection in a country, usually around, change, either a regional dynamic, as we know what happened in Mali was partly a regional dynamic, the fallout from Libya, a lot of armed people who are well trained with a lot of weapons, who are ready to make a change in their country for the better, for worse. But also just election dynamics are a point of inflection. Things that we know what happened with Kenya in 2007, way back then. Was it 2007? Kind of point of inflection around elections. So pay attention to that. It's critically important. The other point is when you go into a country, you often need good partners. Do your due diligence to find a good partner on the ground. It can be helpful. It can also be a double-edged sword. You think of a good partner, but they're only a good partner because they are aligned to the political elite who are ruling at the time. If you have a change of government, you're then on the wrong side, and you find yourself in trouble again. It's just tough. But anyway, whatever you do, find a good partner on the ground. And it's not easy what good here means after a while. But at least get your license, because at least if it's a strong partner initially, you get your license and make sure that they're able to help you get it renewed, because that's another inflection point, license renewal and renewal fees. And often you hear these things like, oh, we're looking at what we have been paying as a IT company or whatever, as a telecoms company in terms of taxes, it is tax avoidance. They just hit you with a tax bill. Sometimes it happens. And to that point, I want to bring in the MTN case. If there's someone from MTN here, I'm sure they can articulate it better than me. I only read it. The issue that has taken place in Nigeria with the fees of, that need to be paid, the penalty of like $5 billion is being negotiated down. I mean, it's quite clear it's taken a very political tone at head of state level, at least that's what the newspapers are saying, and that's what it takes. Again, just paying attention to the regulatory environment, to the inflection points, the change of government. You have to invest. You can't take your eye off the ball when it comes to navigating.
Let me just comment on that specific point, right? Because I think it is a really good illustration, because I sometimes hear here in the UK, people sort of talk about the MTN case and go, oh my God, business in Africa, you can never trust anything. Yeah. But ask Facebook or Starbucks, how they feel about doing business in the UK on that perspective, right? You look at the kind of conversations around paying taxes and so on. And yes, of course it is different, but it's not that different, right? It is a similar situation that you can follow all of the rules in some cases, but in the end, the rules change.
They do change.
And you need to understand that the rules might change before they do, right? So I think if you were an observant listener to the UK society, right, you would pick up on the fact that multinationals not paying taxes in the UK is becoming a major political issue. And that is something that you need to think about as a corporation. Similarly, in Nigeria, right? You have to understand, specifically at the moment with oil revenues the way they are and so on, the likelihood that the tax man is going to get more aggressive is not that an issue. But so be ahead of the curve and kind of listen for the music underneath the words, I think is a really critical.
No, absolutely. And your point about being proactive is very, very, very important. Watch out for corruption, and the more people know that you like giving, the more they ask. So don't get involved in corruption. Stay far away from it. It will help you in the future. But it means that it might just take you longer to get your license. But just stay away from corruption. You will be fleeced by some quick-thinking people there. The other point is. Just observe the rules. I mean, things like there are countries where you've got exchange controls. And often it's quite easy to think you are getting away with it. And one day the central bank will hit you with that. Or someone they're upset with you, they'll find a reason to go after you because you've made some mistake in violating exchange controls. It's often a kind of hidden thing, but when it hits you, it can be very devastating. I think that given the time that we have, it's perhaps best just to, we've said a lot, and we've been, to stop here and then have an interactive session with yourselves. Yep. So who will be the first to jump in? And I think it might just be good to take maybe two at a time so that we yeah, someone wants to go first.
Thank you. Peter Hinton. I'm very interested in the whole area of low-cost education in Africa and the fact that in many cities, more than 50% of children are being educated by low-cost private schools. But as in Lagos, the reality is the majority of those schools are actually not licensed. And I just wonder what examples you may have seen where you can give incentives to government to change the policy, which is often a colonial legacy policy of the classroom has to be this size, or the playground has to be that size, or you have to own the land, which is actually not practical or possible or achievable if you're running a small private school in a township area. So how do you go, have you seen examples where the government does have an incentive to, or you can give the government an incentive to change that situation, which is obviously suboptimal? It also applies to health and sanitation.
Okay. Maybe let's take a second question, comment.
There was one right here.
Hi, my name is Boris.
I think let's take all three, actually. Probably a good idea.
MBA student at Cambridge Business School. I have a question about managing risks. You both touch upon it, but you describe a very, I would say, discrete approach to that. Would there be a way to have some sort of widespread approach where big investors that don't have time to spend doing that work can actually benefit, that can be used for the continent.
So it's a broader risk approach. Okay. I think let's take a third one. There's someone there. Then I've noted the two individuals. Yeah, you go first. Sir.
Okay. I'm Samuel Agbenigam, and my question is really directed at you, Martin. You did mention that currently within organizations, they take an intuition-based approach to managing government agencies, but that should be flipped into a much more data-driven approach. How do you suggest this kind of structure be built? I mean, we're dealing with unpredictable behavioral patterns, and you can't really say that, well, because this particular pattern was noticed in this particular year, we should expect that same approach. How do you suggest people move from intuition-based relationships to relationships that are based on facts and data in dealing with governments?
That's right.
Okay.
Maybe Martin, you should then start with
Yes,
that one back to front.
Let me start with that one, and let me at least
yeah.
cover the risk question, and I'll see if I can have some thoughts on the education space as well. So, very practically, how do you think about a fact-based approach to stakeholder management, right? For me, where it comes from is so I don't think you need to assume that stakeholders are purely rational actors in order to analyze and think about them, right? But because the same thing is true of your customers, right? If you're a company, your customers are not necessarily rational in how they make procurement decisions. Just ask the jewelry industry, and then so it's really understanding and thinking about what I think you need to do a mapping, right? So if you work, let me just take a very concrete example, right? If you work in the oil industry, let's say you work in the oil industry in Uganda, you need to map out the different stakeholders in that area, in the ministry, in the state-owned companies, in the civil society, and you need to do that kind of actor by actor, and then you need to understand how important are they, and how important is the topic that I care about to them. And then understand, what are they interested in? What are they looking for? What is their objectives, right? And this is really an exercise of understanding other types of rationalities, right? Understanding, for example, that, a minister of energy may have other objectives than just, extracting the oil as quickly, as cheaply as possible, right? He may be interested in understanding job creation. He or she may be interested in understanding implications for energy security. Really, but it requires you as a business to adapt a bit of a policymaker thinking. And it could be other irrational things. It could be self-interest related to money, right? Self-interest related to regional background and community background. And so all of these things, it's not easy, but I think that the fact that it isn't necessarily mathematical doesn't mean that you can't apply rigor and analytics to it, right? It is just but it requires a different effort and a different level of resourcing than what you've had historically. Onto the question about risk management. I think I understood your question correctly, but let me just say the following, right? When it comes to managing political risk, historically, a lot of people have taken a kind of country-by-country approach to that. And I've seen a lot of companies making investment decisions that they basically take, they create a sort of, they have a business plan, they have a kind of hurdle rate, and then they apply a kind of risk premium to the discount rate effectively and say, okay, if we require an 8% return on investment if that's our hurdle rate in the UK, then in Mozambique it's going to be 11%, right? Because we have a 3% risk premium. I think that is a moronic approach to risk management, if I'm going to be entirely correct. Because first of all, because it has all kinds of underlying flaws to it. Primarily, it thinks about risks only at a country level and doesn't integrate a kind of project-specific set of approaches, right? If you're building a toilet paper factory just outside of the capital with an immediate offtake and a payback time of 12 months, then your risk premium looks extremely different than if you're investing in a kind of 10-year LNG project in the north of the country, right? So my point on this is I think political risk analysis needs to be fully integrated into your corporate finance and your project evaluation cycle. It needs to be done on a scenario basis, and it certainly needs to be project specific, right? So you need to say, where is my project? How long is the duration of my project? What are the concrete and specific political risk aspects, right? Is it an offtake? Is it an offtake question? Is it an infrastructure question? Is it a question of regulation? Like, that needs to be very specific and needs to be related to the individual project, right? And I understand if you work in the corporate finance department of a big team that's saying, oh, we've applied the sort of X company standard risk premium of X%. That sort of covers your butt in a way relative to your superiors. But I think it is a wholly inadequate approach to thinking about risk management.
If I can jump in there before we deal with the education question. But also you do need a broader enterprise risk management framework, a full ERM, because what Martin has described and well is kind of going with more financial risk, although everything is a financial impact. But you think about legal risk, contract enforceability risk, it's an issue. You go to court and your papers disappear before your case is had. That's a real risk. A risk of finding skills. Skill supply risk is an issue in some African countries. You can't find the engineers in a telecoms company to work for you. So those are risks. So a much broader enterprise risk management is what we need, in addition to the specifics, whether we believe political, core financial, or indeed business continuity, as I mentioned. So make sure that you develop one and make sure that it works. I thought I should jump in there before I forget.
No, absolutely. Great point. And just but very quickly to your point around education, right? It's a very tricky question. And it's a very salient and real issue, I think, in a lot of African countries. And I think it is related to, I think it is the origin of these regulations are more complex, I think, than just saying that they're kind of a colonial heritage, right? They have to do with the role of unions and the power of kind of formalized public sector workers, for example, which in many cases, so many African countries, and by the way, not just in Africa, have a very strong kind of insider-outsider system, right? Where you have few people on the inside that are relatively well paid and relatively well protected, and then but provide a woefully inadequate overall service, which is what has created the market for private sector low-cost education, healthcare, or other things, right? How do you deal with that? Well, the first thing, the ways of creating incentives, hopefully, if the governments are interested in improving outcomes, they should be willing to do that, right? They then need to take on the existing stakeholder coalitions that protect the status quo, and that can have difficult and challenging political consequences, right? So I think the first thing in many of the, especially when it has to do with public services, is to ensure that you have politicians that have incentives to deliver improved outcomes, right? This is true everywhere in the world, but I think it is particularly important and often not the case. If you get there, then I think you need to then empower. Those politicians need to be empowered to do something about the complicated stakeholder landscapes that underlies existing structures and existing incentives and so on. Fundamentally, it's a civil society voter challenge, something governments can also do something about. But yeah, it's definitely not easy. I don't know if you have any.
Oh, it's a tough thing because education is really overregulated, and it should, because you want to ensure quality. We struggle for a start with teachers not showing up, teacher absenteeism and all of that. So there's some real issues, and now to try to develop a kind of disruptive model to the whole sector is not easy. So we tend to do, we trick at the edge and say, look, what we should do is use mobile phones to deliver content, iPads to deliver content, and that's as far as we go in terms of disruption, but not regulatory disruption, which is what you're asking for. How do you build these low-cost, affordable schools? I heard someone was trying it, by the way. That's the big slum in Nairobi, Kibera. I heard someone has been trying something there. Bridge, that's it. Thank you for the name, that's it. Is it originated in an Indian company from India? American, huh? Goodbye. American company called Bridge. So So there's a lead there, but I don't know how the Kenyans have dealt with the regulator. Being Kenyans, they're always innovative. I'm sure the Minister of Education is happy with it. So maybe that's already a good example, but yeah, that's what I've seen. Right. But also, I mean, the World Bank, I like them, and African Development Bank, they are not agents of change and innovation, so they're likely to oppose innovation. And, to the next three questions. I'm watching the time. Okay.
Just a very quick one. You mentioned about risk management and exchange control. Multinational companies who wish to expand in Africa, I mean, in different parts of Africa, foreign currency risk is the major one. So what do you think is the best tool to manage foreign currency risk? Because it's wiping out their investment basically. And exchange control, devaluation is expected to increase in the future. And the other is managing bribe and corruption. I mean, in some countries, it's becoming like part of doing business in Africa. And so once you are in the business, it will occur. And then once it occurs, how do you manage it, or what's the best tool to prevent it? Thank you.
I don't think we have an answer for that, but another input, question, comment of someone over there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ludovic from Cameroon. My question is about trade unifications. As the significant growth projected for economies in Africa materializes, and also as the general political situation settles down, will Africa be likely to see the sort of trade unification experience in the European Union?
You mean the trade unions? Yes. Okay, I get it. So regional integration. Last one, and then we can.
Hi, my name is Stefan Jensen. I'm doing my MBA here. You mentioned some good examples of companies acting as positive forces for social outcomes. You also see the potential for a dark side, ethical challenges by companies engaging too much in order to secure their own interests with politics.
I don't think I understood that question.
Basically, I think the question was around, is there a downside to companies becoming too engaged in politics, basically, or social questions? Is that right?
Yeah, fabulous. So let's start. Let me quickly deal with the issue of the regional integration in terms of what we see happening. Of course, in terms of, you already have regional groupings. You have UMO, you've got the whole CEFA zone, although in three different parts is a regional grouping. You have Southern Africa, the currency-led grouping under the RAND monetary area, and then you've got the SADC, which is more political, which has become more economic, and includes both Southern Africa and East African countries. You have the East Africa community. Now there's something that was signed on the 15th of June 2015 called the Tripartite Trade Zone, which is COMESA, East Africa Community, and SADC. So there's a myriad of these things, a lot of these regional groupings. But the one that, in my view, in all of this, as an additional grouping would I think, have a bit of traction is the East Africa community. That community is keen to come together and reintroduce a single currency. They used to have one, by the way. Then it collapsed because of the tensions between Tanzania and Uganda during Idi Amin's time, basically. That's what happened. And we saw it again being tested, that this relationship, again, in terms of tension between Tanzania and Rwanda over the Eastern Congo or difficulties and so forth. So politics is always a risk to these regional groupings. The region is keen to eventually introduce a single currency and all of that. I'm not a big fan of that. I don't think they should go that far. As long as we have currency convertibility, they are very good at coordinating policy within the region. Budgets are presented on the same day. There's coordination among central bank governors and all of that. There's already, the piping is there, and I think it can make work, but I don't think they should take it as far as having a euro, an East Africa currency. I think it does present a risk. In fact, you can see, I've spent a lot of time studying this, you can see the divergence in just economic fundamentals. You Kenya, Tanzania, and then Burundi. I mean, there's just such vast differences in the economic fundamentals, and I think convergence might be difficult to bring together. And talk about free movement of people. People in Tanzania don't really welcome that, because it's not from Tanzania. What about all those Kenyans coming to buy land in Tanzania and so forth, or the overpopulated Burundi and Rwanda, and people moving across to Tanzania to occupy land? It's an issue for Tanzanians. They don't like free movement of people and visas and so forth. But those are the difficulties of, I've said a lot, but regional integration has its benefits and its costs, and I think you see Africa make progress here. On currency risk, the difficulty with that is most of the countries, in fact, well, the bulk of them, there are no currency hedging instruments, whether they're talking about forward contracts, options contracts, or whatever, to hedge your currency exposure. It's not easy. What I've seen companies do is to sort of use as much domestic currency-based inputs as possible, just to make sure that the inputs and outputs in terms of revenues are all in the same currency. At least you don't suffer from currency volatility in that respect. But it's not easy to hedge your currency in these situations. You just need such a high rate of return that even if the currency collapses by whatever, you still positive. And there are tools for doing that in economics, whether using an interest parity type argument or purchasing power parity argument, which tells you about how likely the currency is going to drop in future, depreciate, and to what extent. And often we get that wrong, but those are the tools we have. And then build that into your revenue forecast. But your challenge is currency risk. Can't hedge easily.
Right. I mean, let me quickly comment on the regional integration. I agree with pretty much everything you said, but I think regional integration on the continent is one of the biggest potential levers for growth and improvement that there is, right? And I think it is true across a bunch of different areas, right? Definitely for trade, definitely for movement of people, infrastructure, right? I mean, I think there's really interesting stuff happening, like in West Africa on power, for example, both with the kind of West African power pool, with things like the Mana River Dam providing power to a bunch of different countries. I think those are, will whenever if it ever gets built. But I think those are all very, very interesting projects that can have huge impact financially and economically. A really basic thing that we've actually done some work on, I think actually together with the African Development Bank, is just on visas. Why can't Africans go to each other's countries without going through incredibly lengthy and complicated visa requirements, right? It's a disgrace, and it's a real problem. Now, my biggest issue with regional integration is I would like it to see move from kind of politicians talking to each other towards making actual change happening. Right? There are like 10 different free trade areas within the African continent, but there's not that much free trade. Yep. So I would love to sort of see some movement away from the kind of institutions over towards the actions of allowing free movement of goods and people and so on. And it is tricky, but it is very, very important.
Yeah. His question about
on the dark side of corporate engagement in public policy, I think that is definitely a risk, right? You definitely, you don't necessarily want an oil company setting your environmental policy, for example. Just sort of to take a completely random example. I will say, though, that in general, and this I think is particularly true in Africa, that to have more public policy being made and being shaped by a broad exchange between different stakeholders, rather than being made kind of at the back room between. I think that will be a step forward, right? So whether that is corporate engagement in this area or whether it is civil society engagement and so on, I do think that kind of more dialogue and more conversations around it is very important, because far too often when governments in Africa make policy that influences the private sector, they do that without having any real understanding of how economics or project development work and so on. And so they can do irreparable harm to economic growth and investment without actually being aware of it. And so that is probably like the main area of concern that I have. But certainly, you want to preserve the independence between the different institutions.
Colleagues, I suspect we have to stop. Because I'm watching the time is 20.
It's a great conversation, though.
Yeah,
we
it's
could
great
keep going
conversation.
for hours, but I suspect our
Can we have 2 more minutes, or should I stop?
I think we're 10 minutes.
We're 10 minutes overshot.
Yeah, we should.
So, colleagues, I think you agree with me. We had an energetic session, a passionate session, and I think that we did touch on the salient features of what is critical when it comes to thinking about navigating the politics of doing business in Africa and, in fact, anywhere. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it.